as we kind of back up and we look at all of the Street Fighter games in the past, one of the things that's also been circulating on FGC social media is this concept of the golden age of footsies. It was better back in my day. It was better in the game probably that you started with or that you excelled in the most. And people can point back to glimpses of, I'm going to say, every game has their glimpse into this pure footsies perfect expectation of Street Fighter 5. Or I'm sorry, of Street Fighter footsies. And in Street Fighter 5, you might point to Karen and what Punk was doing with her as a glimpse to that, but there was a lot more to this game. And even in Season 2, I would say Urian's, beyond all of the crazy BS with the V-triggers and such, Urian's footsies in and of themselves were overpowered. And some people would say that Karen's footsies were overpowered in a way that made the game not fun and not balanced and not that experience that they wanted. But you do have that glimpse of when Punk was using Karen to whiff punish so beautifully, you're like, this is really good Street Fighter, or this is an example of really good Street Fighter. And you can go to Street Fighter 2, and you can see plenty of examples of maybe a Ryu and a Ken matchup where they're just trying to poke each other with low forwards to get the party started. You can go to Street Fighter 3, where the pinnacle of fighting game competition, example, Moment 37, between two very footsie-based characters in a very footsie-based game. And then, like you were saying, John, Street Fighter 4 was very much about footsies, primarily to begin interactions, and I think that's why it's viewed as such. But then the problem with Street Fighter 4 was, once you got that hit, you got that knockdown, you had things like Vortex come in and really upset the balance. So none of these games actually hit that bar of being that pure Street Fighter expectation, that golden age, but I think they all contributed glimpses and perhaps in different capacities to it. And that tells me that there is this idea out there, even if we've never actually realized it in a full game.
I would disagree that I mean, Street Fighter 3, the big thing about that game is people considered it very boring out of the gate because it was such a departure from Street Fighter 2, where you would do specials all day long. And I honestly wonder if Street Fighter 3 is the pinnacle of footsies and fundamental play. But it was considered so boring. It was not successful from Capcom's viewpoint or from the community's viewpoint. It did take off. It took a long time to take off, but I would argue that might be the actual pinnacle of footsies and fundamental play in Street Fighter.
Well, and I think one of, if not the main tweet that has gotten this conversation started about older Street Fighters versus current ones, and it's not even about Street Fighter directly, it's about the aggression mechanics in modern fighting games having us do too much offense, too much skipping of the neutral. And what you're saying there, I think actually plays into this because, well, that's what developers are worried about, is having a game where things are too slow, too turtled up, and it's just like the first person to risk is usually the person that loses at the highest level. That's just going to look like two static characters waiting for the other one to do something, and no one wants to really watch that, at least not on the esports level. So fair enough, but you can also find examples in all of those games, by the way. Like Street Fighter 2, you can queue up the Vega just going off the walls, or Sagat throwing a million fireballs and uppercuts, and how like that game was also not defined by footsies in so many ways. But it did give you sort of that first idea of it. And I think that it would be really helpful, and we try to really hone in on what this exactly is to have a basic sort of definition of what people are wanting when they are talking about pure Street Fighter footsies, because this kind of expands depending on the game that you're playing, or changes. But I would say something like they're looking for strategic, thoughtful maneuvering paired with reactions to showcase raw skill between two players. As the closer that you can get to that, and people emotionally feeling like that's the game that they're playing and that those are the results that they're getting, I think the more satisfied they will be, in theory. Now, you have examples of games like, and we've talked about this on the side beforehand, John, I think you brought up Street Fighter Cross Tekken, a very footsies-based game. Steven, you brought up Sam Show. Oh, so much footsies there. And I would just go straight to High Fight's footsie game, where it's just two characters, they have the same abilities, they have a couple of little mechanics, guard break, parry, that mixes things up a little bit. But man, at the end of the day, that's really just goading with punishing footsies all day. How are those games doing right now? We might acknowledge them as good glimpses of strong footsies, but are people playing them? They want the personality, the color, the differences in characters. And as soon as one of those, you take the high fights game, footsie example, as soon as one of those characters has a farther reaching normal or a faster walk speed, one of them is going to be worse than the other. And you're going to start to get away to an extent from that strategic, thoughtful maneuvering paired with reactions to showcase raw skill between two players. There is an acceptable amount of that. But to not cross that line, especially when you're pairing it with the emotions, the negative emotions of losing, it's hard to find.
I think that the crux of the issue is actually that, because I agree with your description of what true footsies and neutral is. But I believe that the majority of people who make those claims of like, I want to see the return of true footsies, or this game needs to be more footsies based, what I think they're actually saying is, I'm losing and I want something better to make me win. Because I don't think people fully understand what that means, because then if you go like the examples you just brought up, if it's too heavily footsies based, people will complain the other way and be like, well, there's not enough going on here. And it's like, I think that's more of what it is. I think people more
they'll complain about just the character that has the better abilities. Yeah, it's the Season 2 Urian with his crouching medium kick and such, and everything else.
Yeah, and I think that Street Fighter 6 is very interesting and unique in the sense that it's following the discourse about this game since it was announced, and the betas and all of that, and seeing how everything's evolved. It's shown me that the community, most people don't know what they want out of these fighting games. We have seen so many complaints about Street Fighter 6 and so many different things that have answers and that have evolved into totally tolerable stuff. And yet it's like people have just complained about everything, every which way. I don't think people really know what they want. What they really want is, they won't say it, but what they really want is, I want to be able to win, and I want to be able to do it as easily as I can. Exactly.
You can never, that will always be there, and it will always be muddying the waters, and that you're absolutely right that is a component, but you can't, I don't think you can say that's the only component, because there is a certain amount of, when the BS comes in, this game, as far as my understanding, even when it's not clouded by my negative emotions of losing, is no longer the strategic, thoughtful maneuvering paired with reactions to showcase raw skill between two players that I want it to be.
Yeah, I just, it's cracking me up here because we talked about 5 during that era, and people were so upset and so mad about that game that they said no one's ever going to have nostalgia for this game. No one's ever going to say that, 5, we should go back to it because of the footsies and other stuff like that. And it's such a great indicator. John Velociraptor touched on this earlier, of whatever era you came from, whatever game you grew up in, whatever game you got great at, that's the one that you want to see reflected in the new games, because it's going to give you an advantage. It's what you fell in love with. So you want to see that replicated. But so often it's not the case that it gets replicated like a 1-to-1 or even close to that. These games have to evolve, or you get Capcom Fighting Jam again, and that was basically a complete rehash of past stuff that Capcom has done. And the big complaints that, and Ono talked about this, was that there wasn't enough new stuff. There wasn't enough new things going on. And so the game didn't do well. It was very mediocre in terms of its reception, all this other kind of stuff. And so the developers are always challenged to bring new flavors to these games, because if not, why aren't we just playing the old ones again? We've got those old games. But the community, collectively, especially a lot of the passionate and hardcore players, are like, well, why aren't you bringing back more stuff from 4? And crazy enough, why aren't you bringing back more stuff from 5? Which I knew would happen, yet I'm still a little surprised that is happening.
It makes me want to puke.
That V trigger, or that Nikali V skill 2.
Yep, that's me right now behind the scenes.
Okay, so I want to kind of transition here to a more direct thing that people say is an issue that I don't think is quite the issue. If we look at the pure footsies examples, Sam Show, SFXT, High Fights footsies, it's like, okay, people respect those, but they're not really playing them. They want more than that. And so I go, well, those are footsies, and for the most part, it's like, what are people thinking about when they say Street Fighter pure footsies? Is it just hand-to-hand combat? Is it whiff punishing with your normals and your, maybe your dashing maneuvers, maybe the jumps, but it's not the kind of footsies that when you talk about Marvel vs. Capcom, and like you were talking about earlier, John, that's more of a, you position much farther back, because now in your maneuvering, your skillful maneuvering around each other, that has to include the ability to teleport, the ability to like fly and zip across the screen and appear behind you. And that's acceptable in the Marvel vs. Capcom space because, well, that's set from the outright. That's not quite what people want from Street Fighter, maybe. Or maybe it's simply that you can, the balance of having those abilities, those kinds of advances paired with what you can do against them is okay in Marvel vs. Capcom versus what's going on in maybe Street Fighter 6 with certain characters' drive rushes is not. But I don't think that it's okay to just say we don't want neutral skips at all. Sajam just came out with a video where he talked about this, and he showed that neutral skips have been a thing since the beginning. And you could even argue, like I was saying earlier, that jumping is a neutral skip, and it is, but no one really has a problem with jumping because you have anti-air. So that's balanced and it's conspicuous enough that we can see, yeah, that can be part of the mix because I have an answer to it. So I think it's more than just wanting pure footsies. It's wanting a purer back and forth where I have the answers and I can respond with my reactions in a way that is tangible enough to me that I feel like I can do it, and then I'm okay with losing. And you're always gonna have that muddying negative emotion. I just want to complain on Twitter, so I'm gonna say outlandish things and make outlandish claims. But at the heart of it all, I do think it's more than just footsies that people want. In fact, they don't want just pure footsies. They want balanced back and forth. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I would immediately go to the phrase an earned win and being outplayed. When you get done, do you feel like your opponent earned that win and that they legitimately outplayed you? And the answer for most people in the fighting game community, every time they lose, is going to be no. We say good games all the time. We say it all the time. How often do we actually mean that? and again, there's a little bit of it's definitely not my problem. It's not my problem I lost. It's the game. It's my controller. It was the lag. It was all this other kind of stuff. And boy, does that run rampant in the FGC. Just really, 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 really bad. And so, but that's where I would go back to is that people want, like, they want to feel like they lost and it was justified, but it's so rarely that they're in a mindset to actually accept the loss and to hold the L.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out that clip from our recent episode of Talkin' Block. The whole conversation will be up in a few days, and once it is, you can click on it right here. But if you need to tide yourself over with something else, you got similar content right here. And of course, we would love to hear your opinion on whether or not you think Street Fighter 5 or Street Fighter 6 is the more scrubby when it comes to footsies Street Fighter entry.